Hey everyone, welcome to the Unhandled Exception podcast. I'm Dan Clark, and this is episode number 50. And I feel I should be sat here with a beer or something to celebrate, but it is only 10 o'clock in the morning. But our guest here today, it's the evening, so David, you've got no excuse to not to have a beer in your hand right now, so welcome to the 50th episode.
Thank you. I can't believe, oh my gosh, what an honour. I didn't realise. I would have had a beer had I known, but oh well. Congratulations. Congratulations on 50.
Oh, thank you. Well, I feel I should go and get one now anyway, even though it is 10 in the morning, but I don't actually think I've got one in my fridge, but never mind. Yeah. So to put a name to the voice and introduce David on properly, today we are joined by David Wengier from Melbourne, Australia. And David is a developer at Microsoft working on Roslyn. So that's both C# and, I'm sorry, VB. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry.
Not as sorry as me when I have to write it, but we can talk about that later.
And also Razor tooling. But today we're actually going to be talking about Hot Reload and how that works in .NET in an audio-only podcast. David, how are we going to do this?
Well, I don't know. So I guess I should probably firstly maybe say what I think of when I think of Hot Reload, because so I work on Roslyn, as you said. Roslyn is the sort of engine at the very bottom of Hot Reload. So edit and continue is a feature that's been around for a while, and Hot Reload is a different scenario that works in. And so when I think Hot Reload, I think very sort of low-level tech, like, you know, a .NET DLL, there's metadata and there's IL and there's all this stuff, which we can talk about if you want. And how do we update that? That's what I think of as Hot Reload. There is a little bit of a funny thing where Hot Reload's also kind of a marketing-ish term, and it's kind of the term for a broad set of features that was added, and it covers XAML and it covers web, live, refresh, or whatever, which I know a lot less about. But so the actual technical bits, I think, it's sort of the bit that I don't see many people talk about. And I listen to a lot of podcasts and I don't hear anyone talk about it. So I'm hoping that maybe we'll be able to make it understandable. I don't know. We'll find out.
It's going to be fun. Yeah. And I think a lot of knowing the listeners and the target audience, I think they will appreciate us going a bit further under the hood anyway. So that'll be quite good.
Yeah. It's a funny thing where the things I work on, sometimes I get to talk about them and it's very much as an educational thing. I'm getting the word out about whatever feature we've worked on, or, you know, new language versions or whatever it is. But when it comes to Hot Reload, I am totally talking about it just because I'm interested in it, and it's the type of thing that I like knowing. But except for basically me and one other guy on the Roslyn team, nobody actually needs to know to this level of detail. I'm going to tell you anyway. But, you know, so it always feels a bit funny sometimes explaining all of this in-depth stuff, because at the end of the day, other than interest, which is good, yeah, it's sort of a niche kind of topic. But, you know, I'm sure it informs other things, even if you don't realize it does. You know, knowing what goes on under the hood is well, I'm a fan of that in general.
Yeah, definitely. And I guess before we talk about that, we were speaking about this before we started recording. It's an audio-only podcast, but so the listeners can't see. But I've got to call out your background and all the wonderful Lego behind you.
It is something I thoroughly enjoy. So we moved into this house in the end of 2020. So we've been here 2 years. But this is the first time I've ever actually been able to have all of my sets that I own on shelves and in the background of my camera. And so every Teams meeting at work, invariably most people use the, you know, hide your background thing because they don't want anyone to see it. I'm like, no. I've waited years to be able to show this off. It's mostly cars. There's a little bit of space stuff. There's a DeLorean, but yeah. We could do a whole podcast on Lego maybe some other day.
I'll have to take a screen grab at the end of, in fact, I'm going to do it now because I'm going to forget. Oh dear, I'm pulling an awful expression there. I might try that again. Okay, cheesy grin before I forget.
Perfect.
There we go. I will include that in a tweet and the show notes so everyone can see your wonderful background. Oh no, I've just seen my actual background, which is going to be included on it, which is an absolute tip. I'm glad this is audio only.
Well, I can only see a half a guitar, an MVP award, some soundproofing, and is that a tiger?
A tiger? Where's this?
A drawing of a tiger behind your...
Oh, I see. On my kid's drawing. Yes.
Yeah.
I think it's our cat Scratch.
Oh, there you go. If there's any rubbish on the floor, I can't see it, so you're safe.
Oh, so you can't see it over there, the cupboard that's open that's got... Oh, fantastic. Because that is an absolute mess, and I meant to close it, and I realise I haven't, but luckily you can't see it.
Oh, good.
Anyway, we should probably talk about Hot Reload, but before we do, I'm just going to do this episode's listener mention. And this one goes to Suraj Kentura, who tweeted out about my new YouTube channel, saying, I didn't know you had a YouTube channel. Great to see a face to the friendly voice from the Unhandled Exception podcast. Way to go, Dan. So thank you, Suraj, for mentioning both the podcast and the YouTube channel, which obviously the YouTube channel is very, very new, but I will link to that in the show notes in case anyone's interested. And if you want to get mentioned on the show, just send a tweet using hashtag #UnhandledException. All feedback is greatly appreciated, and I'm Drakan on Twitter. And also don't forget that this podcast now has its own Slack channel. If you head over to the website unhandledexceptionpodcast.com, you'll see a big Slack link there. And lastly, a quick reminder that this podcast is sponsored by Everstack, which is my own company providing software development and consultation services. For more information, visit everstack.com. Right. I guess before we dig too deep with Hot Reload, we should actually talk about what it is.
Yeah. Well, so yeah, Hot Reload is a lot of things to a lot of people, depending on your point of view. But in general, the idea of Hot Reload, the sort of elevator pitch, I guess, is the idea is to be able to speed up your workflow so that while you're writing code, you don't have to stop what you're doing, change some code, start your application again, navigate through to wherever you were or enter in whatever data again, etc. It's just supposed to speed up. We call it the developer in a loop is the Microsoft term. And it's just supposed to speed that up. So you make a change and it can be applied in your running application or website or mobile app or whatever technology. And the next time that code is run, it will be the updated code. That's the summary. That's the shortest summary I can come up with anyway.
I guess to just touch on the term in a loop there, where if I think back to quite a few years where I used to do web forms development, and it was using Kentico on top of it, so like for the example I'm thinking of, so that might have made it even worse. But I remember every time I made a change, I had to wait like a minute to actually see that in the browser. And for productivity, that was an absolute nightmare. Where now, as you say, it's kind of like just being able to change code and see it immediately. Productivity is like, because it's not just the interruption and the waiting. During that waiting, your mind goes off and does other things and you start getting distracted. So you've got to pull yourself back. So it's constantly pulling you out of the zone. So yeah, anything we can do to just get that immediate feedback is just incredible.
Yeah, and even small things like, it got progressively better over time, and so then it got to the point where on the web you could refresh the page, and maybe you saved everything in session, and you had cookies, and so everything was fine. But you still have to refresh the page, and if you wanted your page to be smart and remember what you'd entered as a draft, well, you had to write that code to do that. I think maybe the browsers help a bit more now, but every little progressive thing that gets that inner loop better and faster is just an amazing speed up. I mean, I came from VB6 is where I sort of started doing real programming, and I remember the first time I used C# and I was so annoyed because edit and continue wasn't actually available in the first versions, and it just didn't make sense to me how anyone could work like this, which is funny because my dad was a lifelong COBOL programmer, and so even whatever we had in C# version 1, he would have been amazed by. But yeah, it's just once you experience that speed of the inner loop, I think you sort of summed it up in a really good way. It's removing the barrier between you having a thought of maybe this will work and then seeing the results.
And I know you mentioned this was more the marketing side, but as in just from, I think you mentioned things like XAML and all this kind of thing. From all the stuff we've got in .NET, like Blazor, XAML and MAUI and all that kind of stuff, yep. Does it work across all of those things?
So that's a good question with an interesting and probably long answer. But in general, the theory is yes. So for me on the Roslyn, side of things, what I work on, strictly speaking, I work on edit and continue, which is the feature that's been around that is sort of at the heart of hot reload. And hot reload is that idea, but applied without needing the debugger to be attached and without needing you to have a breakpoint to stop so you can change your code. You can change it while it's running. And so from my point of view, they're all exactly the same, all of those environments, because all I'm doing is there's a DLL which has your code and you're running it, and we have to update the code that is running. And so that is true. I mean, the beauty of .NET cross-platform is that DLL is the same DLL for Maui and Blazor and Blazor WASM and all these things. It's IL, it's compiled to a cross-platform format. So from my point of view, yes, they're all the same. From the user's point of view, though, sadly, no, there's lots of different capabilities. For example, if you're running, you mentioned Maui or Blazor WASM uses the mono runtime, not the core CLR runtime. And so there's slightly different capabilities that each of those two runtimes have. And so what is possible, the same code change could be possible on a Windows desktop application, but not possible on Blazor WASM because of the runtime doesn't support that type of change. And so there's lots of different edge cases, and there's lots of things where sort of we as Roslyn hand these changes over to the runtime, and then that's the .NET runtime. On top of that sits, whatever your app runtime is, so ASP.NET or Maui or Xamarin or whatever it is, they have to do some work as well. In ASP.NET, if you change a Razor view, we can update the code for that Razor view, but ASP.NET has to do some work to make sure that the next request gets to that new code, which could be that they need to not cache it. It could be that they need to reevaluate some things. So there's lots of different moving pieces, and support can vary when you get down to the details.
Yeah, that makes sense. I can imagine this could be the kind of thing where on the front of it, it sounds quite simple, but actually implementing it is kind of like the listeners can't see your expression now, but I'm guessing there's lots of issues that have been hit. And I know you did an NDC talk quite recently, and I've got to confess, I started watching it this morning whilst at the gym, so it was I was listening audio only. I only got halfway through, so I was gutted that I didn't actually start watching it a bit sooner. So I'm kind of like, I've got half the story, but I think I'm going to go back later and watch the other half, but hopefully that's okay, because I need to assume that listeners haven't watched any of it anyway, so that's fine.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that it sounds complicated sounds simple, but probably is complicated, because it kind of is, but then it's also kind of the opposite, where I think it looks like magic, but like in that conference talk you talked about, the talk is titled "How Does Hot Reload Work?" and the actual bit where I explain how it works, it's about 2 minutes long. It's actually really very simple. There's just all of this background to get to it, which a lot of people do know lots of the in-depth internals of .NET. I personally didn't before I started working on it. I kind of had this life policy of never wanting to know IL. I really love C#, and I love that high-level language, and I kind of like knowing what the compiler does to make it a little bit lower, but I'd never really wanted to know IL. It reminds me too much of assembly, which takes me back to university and makes me want to run away. So I kind of didn't really want to ever understand as much about how a .NET DLL works as I do now. But now that I do know, it actually is kind of a simple concept. Once it's explained, it's actually like, okay. Or at least I think so. Maybe, I don't know, maybe I'd, working in it, obviously I'm biased. I'm exposed to it in a lot of ways. But so it's kind of like this weird thing where it seems to me like complete magic, but then it's also kind of simple. But also, if you think about what it's doing, it's actually completely, like, it's ridiculous that it works at all, I think. Knowing how VB6 works, like, so again, this is where I'm coming from, right? I'm coming from in VB6, I used to step through my code, and until my cursor was on that line of code, VB hadn't even looked at the code yet, right? It interpreted that line when I demanded it. Compare that to we produce a DLL and it never changes. It's such a different concept, but somehow the code can get updated. It's kind of mind-bending.
I find it quite interesting what you're saying about once you understand it and everything just clicks together and it's like actually understanding how things work. Because I mentioned my YouTube channel earlier, and one of the videos I've done is a 15-minute video on understanding Git under the hood. And I can hear lots of very similarities here, because when you understand how it works under the hood, it's super simple.
Yeah.
Like with the object types, it's not complicated at all. But it's kind of like no one learns that next step, but actually it kind of like simplifies things. And it's just like, I think the old phrase of it's only complicated till you know it.
Yeah.
Definitely applies.
I think there's a few key things that unlock that sort of knowledge. So for Git, I'm not going to say I understand it in depth, but I have used the reflog once successfully. But like to me, Git is like, once you've worked out that everything is a hash and everything is a hash of a hash or a hash of a bunch of hashes, it all kind of falls into place and like the mystery falls away. And I think the same thing exists in Hot Reload, where once you understand how the metadata in a .NET DLL works, I think Hot Reload kind of falls away as well, and it becomes kind of simple. I don't know. I can jump into an explanation, or I don't know how we want to get onto that. But yeah, that's the key for me is that understanding that metadata, and then once you've got a mental model of it, that's kind of like the key that's then, well, okay, here's your mental model of a .NET DLL, and then if I tell you here's how Hot Reload works, it's like, oh, okay, yeah, makes sense.
Sounds good. So shall we talk about relational databases?
So you did watch the talk.
Well, you mentioned that in the first half, which is what I did get to.
And that's the mental model for me. And I think I said in the talk, like, potentially I'd get kicked out of a database conference for saying this, but I look at the metadata tables and, well, the first time I looked at them, and so I use ILSpy. I love ILSpy, but, .peak is the same, and I'm sure Reflector does the same thing. They show you metadata. So I think everyone knows that in a DLL, in a .NET DLL, there's IL code, right? Your code is compiled to IL, and that's usually what we look at when we look at these tools like ILSpy. You either look at the IL to see what the code was compiled to, or you get it to decompile that IL back to C# so you can actually understand it, because I still maintain I don't want to know about IL. But at the top, there's this section that says metadata, and, maybe you look at it, maybe you don't. It's a bunch of funny numbers. It's a bunch of hex addresses. It looks, it's not horribly confusing, but I personally unless I had a reason to be there, I would avoid it. But yeah, the mental model that unlocked that for me is thinking about it as a relational database. And it basically is. And in fact, I didn't know this. So I did the conference, it was in Sydney in September. And I swear I did not know this at the time. A couple of weeks ago in a Teams chat, someone in the .NET, runtime Teams chat, someone was giving a brief history of the start of .NET. And I've heard lots of different histories about the starts of .NET, and I'm sure everyone has. But this was highly internal, like before it was called .NET or whatever. The first idea was to use the Microsoft Access JET database to store this metadata. And I was like, wait, so it is actually a relational database. So the way a .NET DLL works is there's a relational database inside. And so the metadata has to describe everything that is in your DLL. It's kind of how cross-platform stuff works. Rather than, if you call a method from another DLL, the C# compiler doesn't say, we're calling this address in this file, right? It's not a memory address. It's nothing that low level. It is, I'm calling a method called, WriteLine from a class called console in a namespace called system in a assembly called system.console. And that's the level it goes to. It goes to assembly name. It doesn't go to file name, it goes to assembly name. But that unlocks cross-platformness, because then the runtime says, right, I need to find an assembly called system.console. The DLL doesn't care whether that's in mscorelib or system.private.corelib or system.console.dll when .NET Core 1.0 came out and they thought, let's have 1,000 DLLs with 4 functions each in them. So that the metadata describes everything about your code. And so it does it in a relational database. There's a table for all of the types you declare. There's a table for all of the methods, so that types have methods. There's a table for properties. There's a table for fields. It is, if you could imagine creating an SQL Server database to describe your code, not your architecture, not your application, but your code, it's basically what you would expect. And so once you've got this mental model of a relational database, well, all hot reload is a bunch of update statements. So you've got a class, person, classic example, right? It's got a property first name and a property last name. So that's a record in the type table called person, and it's got a primary key. Let's just assume that for now. And then the property table has 2 rows, one called last name, one called first name. And I actually can't remember for properties whether the property table has a type ID to go backwards or the type table points forwards, but it doesn't matter. There's a link there, right? There's a foreign key relationship between these two. So we're just describing the code. So if I were to change, for example, the property is a terrible idea. Okay. I've started with a bad example. Let's say we're changing the return type of that property. We'll change last name from a string to, I don't know what, something else. What hot reload needs to do is it needs to tell the runtime basically 2 things. It needs to tell it, well, the type of this property has changed to this, and it needs to tell it, here's the code for this property as well. The code for the property is stored sort of separately in this blob, and so it just gives it that new blob of information, and the runtime takes it, and away we go. But that changing of the property type, you can think of it as saying, find the row for the last name property and update it, and here are the new values. And all the runtime does is copy those new values in, and that's it. So if the value for return type used to say string, and it now says, string builder, long string, I don't know, the runtime just updates it. And that's kind of how hot reload works. Like, it's as simple as that, but then obviously that's a simplification.
So, and presumably all of this is happening in memory. There's nothing actually, it's not touching the original metadata or anything.
That's right, yes. So the database exists in the DLL, and then the way I think about it is the runtime reads that DLL in, and it sort of copies it to its own in-memory database, which is the thing you're sort of querying with reflection. You're not querying the file. The file is never updated. The file doesn't change on disk. What that also means, though, is a hot reload update, it kind of doesn't necessarily produce a valid DLL. There's no function in the runtime to save the updated database back to the DLL. There couldn't be without a lot of work because it's not representative anymore. Once it's been read in, there's optimizations and things like that happen. It's a read-only database is the way to think about it. And I've just said that hot reload is update statements, but then I've said it's a read-only database. So how does that work? So the DLL, definitely read-only. The runtime has code that knows how to update it. And some of that code is pretty gnarly. Firstly, it's written in C++, so it's not for the faint of heart to read. But if you make certain changes, adding a field to a method, for example, it's not just inserting a row in a database because, of course, it's not really a database. It's a structure in memory. And so after the runtime accepts that field insert, it might have to go and recalculate a whole bunch of data in memory. It might have to relay out a whole bunch of arrays or things because everything still has to line up nicely, and it has to be in a certain order, etc. There's all of the rules that the ECMA spec, for a .NET DLL. Like, there's a spec for what a DLL has to look like, and that has to be maintained. And so the runtime maintains that in its representation as well. So it's, in some respects, it would be really easy if it was an actual database, but of course it's not. But the runtime takes care of that, and I don't personally need to worry, so that's good. But there's a bunch of, where hot really gets interesting, I think, is there's lots of optimizations. So if you accept that there's a relational database in your DLL, and you accept that it has a table and there's foreign keys, then great. That's the mental model to have. But the reality, of course, is very different, because if there was an actual database in your DLL would be huge, and we don't want that, and nor do you, right? And so there's lots of work we want to make these DLLs as small as possible, as efficient as possible. it turns out that, storing code efficiently is actually relatively, well, C# text is just about the most efficient way to store C# code, turns out. When you convert that to IL, it gets a bit bigger. You add in the metadata, it gets a bit bigger. If you've ever done, AOT compiling, it gets even bigger. So we have to be mindful of all these things. And so there's a bunch of optimizations and a bunch of shortcuts that are taken in order to get the size small, but that's where some of the tricks and some of the magic kind of comes through. So you can think about it as a relational database, but the reality is very different. The best example, I think, is primary keys. So I said there was a primary key, right, in the type table or in the property table. And it's something called a metadata token. And if you look in ILSpy or whatever, it'll show you the token. And it's a 8-digit number in ILSpy. And you look at it and it means nothing. But the first byte of it, so the first 2 digits, are a flag, or they tell you which table this key is for. So the table itself is encoded in the key, which is really weird. You don't do that in databases, right? And then the next 3 bytes are the ID. But if you think about this database, the C# compiler writes out this database, starts at the start, writes it out at the end, and then it stops, and it's never going to change ever again. So the actual ID, they're just incrementing integers. It goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's never any gaps. It always starts at 1. These are rules baked into the ECMAScript. Fine. So that's a bit of a weird key, but it still makes sense as a key. But then if you think about how you would read a DLL, well, so you open the DLL, and according to the spec, the first table is, whatever it is. Let's pretend it's the type table. It's not, but I don't know what it is. But so you read the type table, you read the first row. Well, you don't need the primary key because I know I'm reading the type table, which is ID 2. I know I'm reading the first row, which is row number 1. So I know that the primary key must be 02000001. I don't need it to be in the database. So this database with primary keys and foreign keys doesn't actually have any primary keys. They are completely calculated, which is, I'm assuming there's no database out there on Earth that actually does that. But to me, that's where sort of like this, the beauty of hot reload comes out of these little tricks done that if you thought about it from the point of view of here's a bunch of data and there's no IDs, it would be horrible. But if you start by thinking about it as a relational database and then you realize that it's an optimization, to me anyway, it's like it maintains its understandability.
So if the index part is just inferred and not actually stored, presumably that means does that not make your job even harder for hot reload for updates because number 5 isn't always going to be number 5 depending on what else gets inserted before it?
Exactly. Yes. 100% spot on. And that's kind of why I say hot reload. The concept is simple because it's just update statements. But the reality is, it's update this table where I'm not sure because there's no key to it for the where clause. Yeah. So the way it works, and I'll see if I can do the 5-minute summary, but don't time me. So the C# compiler produces DLLs that follow the ECMA 335 spec. That's all it does. It only knows how to do that. For hot reload, we tell it to produce what's called a delta compilation. So you had your original DLL, now you've made some changes, that gives us a delta, and we say to the compiler, go and produce a delta compilation. It doesn't write it to disk as a DLL, but the only thing it knows how to do is produce an ECMA-compliant DLL. So it writes out metadata tables for this delta that describe all of the work it's doing. So it's not what's in it's what's in the delta, right? It's as it compiles a method, adds a row to the method table. As it compiles a type, adds a row. And so in the delta, all of the IDs follow the rules, so they all start at 1. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So if I've got 3 methods in my DLL, ID 1, 2, 3, if I update the middle one, the second one, and do a hot reload, in the delta compilation, that has to be ID 1. There can't be any gaps, it has to be in order, so it has to be ID 1. So what we have in hot reload, or in edit and continue, there's two extra tables in the metadata called ENC map and ENC log, meaning edit and continue, log and map. The log is a log. It tells the runtime what edit and continue is doing. So edit and continue says, I am updating this method. I am updating this type by adding a new method, or I am adding a new field. It's just a log. And the map is for mapping row numbers. So the map says row number 1 in this Delta compilation is row number 5 from the original compilation. And so using those two pieces of information, the runtime is able to take the new data, refer to the map, do it in order of the log, and make the right updates.
I see, that makes sense.
So in Roslyn, my first exposure to this in Roslyn was writing, it's all test-driven. All the edit and continue stuff is all test-driven. I mean, most of Roslyn's test-driven. It's fantastic. And so you write a test that says, here's some code, here's some new code, here's what I expect the metadata tables to look like. And the ENC map and the ENC log are keys. Like, they have to be right, and you have to make sure they're doing what you expect. That's how you prove that this test has passed. But those tables are, well, there's 2 4-byte numbers in the log and 1 1-byte number, and the map has 2 4-byte numbers. So it's just hex data, and you're staring at this hex data and like 6, 4, 7. Is that right? It took me it took me a while, but eventually I noticed like, oh, hang on, I can read this now. Like, I don't have to decipher it anymore. I can look at it and go, that should be a 7. Damn it.
Was this like the Matrix then? You can now see the
Exactly.
Matrix.
Exactly. And that's what, like, when I say like the mystery falls away, like that's what I mean. I remember looking at the metadata tables in ILSpy, and I think I tweeted about like complaining about, like, how come there's no good tools to show me what these metadata tables actually mean? And I got a bunch of responses from people who were much smarter than me and been around this, trying to guess at what I meant. And I realized, a few weeks later that, well, the reason they were having to guess and didn't quite understand it was because there is no better visualization. You just have to work out what it says. The magic numbers, they're not actually magic. They just look it. Once you can realize what they are, well, you don't need a visualization anymore.
I know when, so I mentioned before, I only got a chance to watch half of the video before I had to run back from the gym to be here. But at that point, you were just starting to mention a tool called MDV for helping visualize. Well, I don't know whether it was to visualize this stuff or.
It's called Visualize. MDV stands for Metadata Visualizer, but it's a console app that produces text only, so it's not very visual. MDV is fantastic. So the person on the Roslyn team who taught me all of the edit and continue stuff, his name is Tomasz. He's very smart. I'm pretty sure he invented it all, or if not, he's certainly the one person who knows it the most now. But I was talking to him about how do I reason about this and reason about that? And he said, all you need is MDV. MDV is the only tool you need for looking at metadata. And I thought, this is great. I'll go and see where it is. And then he said, well, I think I found it, and I couldn't run it. Like, it wasn't, it's in a repo online. It's open source on GitHub, but you couldn't download it. It wasn't a tool. It was a NuGet package, which didn't make sense to me. And I'm like, hang on, how do I use this, whatever? And he said, MDV is designed for people who have read ECMA 335. And I have not. But no, it's not that bad. What it does is it outputs the tables as text visualizations. And I mean, it is a visualization because, for example, it includes the metadata tokens, which, as I said, they don't exist, but it includes them because it calculates them. It includes all of the strings in your DLL. All the IL code is there. Like, it just dumps out the whole thing. But it is the tool, and as far as I know, the only tool that understands how to read Delta compilations as well. And so when you are talking about hot reload, it's absolutely invaluable. If you're just looking at a DLL, I would say these days, it probably doesn't show you any more than ILSpy or .peak does, because I think everybody, in the history of .NET, as it's progressed, I think everyone now I feel like everyone's more interested now in the internals than perhaps they were in the past. There were these tools, ILDASM, that came with the framework that I remember running and thinking, I don't know why I'd ever want this, and I closed it again, But I think now we're sort of more used to looking at it. So I think for just a DLL, MDV is the same as those tools. But yeah, for hot reload or edit and continue, it shows you everything, basically.
Yeah, that's very cool. So going back to your example, you gave an example, which I'm assuming that was a cherry-picked, simple example that just works, how you described it. What are some examples which have been really, really tricky to fit with this hot reload of changes you might make in some code?
So that's a good question. There's actually a couple of things to this. There's a side of hot reload I haven't really talked about yet as well, which is where, so the compiler is obviously part of Roslyn, but the other part of Roslyn is the IDE experience, which is part of Visual Studio. It's also kind of part of command line builds with .NET formats, part of VS Code. And that's where a lot of the edit and continue stuff lives. And its job is to take your code that you've edited. So you're working in C#, it's very high level. If you change something in a C# file, we have to work out what changed. And again, for efficiency, we want that to be very quick, and we want it to, we could just send the whole project or the whole solution back to the compiler and say, compile a DLL, and then we'll compare the DLLs and work out what's changed. That's very slow, obviously. And so we don't do that. So there's a whole bunch of code in the IDE part of Roslyn that takes your syntax trees that you're producing, even if you don't know you are, and compares them efficiently and comes up with essentially a to-do list for the compiler. So if I change what's inside a method, then the compiler just needs to be told, compile that method. And so when it goes through the whole project, it basically goes through and says, I'm on file A. Is there anything in here for me to do? And it looks at its to-do list. The to-do list tells it what the class name is as well as the method, And it says, nope, nothing for A, nothing for B. Oh, there's a method in C. Okay. So it starts going through class C and it just goes through, found a property. Is this on the list? No. Found a method. And so we produce a to-do list. So the more complicated things, as far as hot reload's concerned, is where to a .NET assembly, there are very few concepts. There's methods, there's fields, there's parameters, there's properties, there's types. That's about it. There's namespaces, but namespaces is really just data. It's not actually a thing. And even properties aren't really a thing because properties is just a get method and a set method in disguise, right? Events are a thing, but then they're also just an add method and a remove method in disguise. So .NET, the .NET assembly, has a very simplified structure. C# is this super rich high-level language. And so some of the more complicated things are, for example, records in C# 9. I did all of the code for how records work in edit and continue, and it was so much fun because when you do the smallest change in a record, it can have a huge effect on what the compiler will actually produce. So if I add a field to a record, that's a new field, fine. But the compiler will also output, or will also change the copy constructor, the toString method, the print members method, the clone method, the equals method, the get hashcode method, etc., etc. And so when it's Roslyn's job to say, you as the developer have added a field, when it's Roslyn's job to tell the compiler what to do, it needs to tell the compiler all of these things, right? The compiler knows that for a record it has to construct a toString method, but it doesn't know that for this Delta compilation, it should write that to the DLL unless the IDE tells it. So a lot of the complexity there comes from translating, in effect, from C# into .NET, which is kind of weird because that's the compiler's job, but we also have to do it as well, but differently. And that's also where a lot of root edits come from as well. So a root edit is something where editing continues not supported. One of the levels that root edits come from is from Roslyn because either we haven't taught it how to deal with this yet. For new language features, that's often the case. Or, maybe it has such a complicated effect that it's impossible to do it efficiently or whatever it is. But so a lot of complexity comes in there before it even gets to all the DLL stuff I've even been talking about.
So when you mentioned new language features, then that made me start thinking about, and they're obviously doing a new version every year now, and with more syntax sugar and all this kind of stuff in there. presumably from the get-go, you're having to work quite heavily with the language designers to actually make sure that you're being able to support hot reload quite early on.
Yeah. So not so much the language designers. I don't personally get involved at that level because the language design meetings are on at about 2 a.m. my time. So I've never actually been to one. But that's we don't want hot reload to influence the language anyway, right? The language is what it is, and it needs to be designed for its own purposes. We sometimes might talk to the compiler developer who's implementing that language feature about how that feature might work internally. Although even then, we kind of can cheat a little bit because edit and continue or hot reload, they only work in debug builds. And so we can sort of take some shortcuts. So if you've ever looked in a decompilation of an async method, it produces a state machine. In a debug build and a release build, they look very different. And the debug build has a lot of extra stuff to help with debugging. And it's a class and not a struct is used for performance. Like a struct is used in release mode for performance, but in debugging we use a class because it's easier to manage. So we kind of can cheat and we put some extra stuff in the PDB just to help us reason about the changes for edit and continue. So we can kind of get around limitations there. But yeah, we sort of have this relationship with the compiler where whichever compiler developer is implementing a feature, their job is to make edit and continue work. And I'm doing air quotes there. They basically have to make it not crash, right? When edit and continue sees a new language construct, it has to not die, but it doesn't have to successfully apply all possible updates. Often we'll then come in after the fact with our slightly more specialized knowledge about how the edit and continue pieces work to then make those bits work. So basically what that means is any new compiler feature that is large, from day one, it's just a root edit. I've seen a record syntax. Stop. It's a root edit. Can't do it. And then we come in later and say, okay, well, here's how we process a record. And sometimes that, we have to talk to the runtime sometimes about, well, how should we represent this? How do you want us to update this? Sometimes we cheat and we don't talk to the runtime and we do it anyway, which they're the fun ones. I recently added support for deleting a method, but the runtime doesn't support deleting a method. So we just lie to the runtime, which is fun. But yeah, it is, some of the, we had some root edits, you couldn't change a namespace on a class, for example. And that was at the namespace declaration level. So if edit and continue saw a namespace declaration, it just stopped and said, no, root edit can't continue. And we were talking about this, and as the edit and continue code evolved for other features we were doing, we sort of got to the point where we realized we can support this by just removing that bit of code. We don't actually have to do any work for a namespace change at all because it's just part of a type name, and the compiler will compile that type, and the runtime will update that type, and that's it. It'll either, the code will either compile or it won't. If you're referencing it via the old name, well, your code won't compile, so that's not a problem. If you change the code to reference the new name, well, we'll see that change and we'll hot reload that method. So what was a root edit is now not, because we essentially just realized we didn't have to do any work at all. So some of them are free, essentially. It really depends.
And I can picture where you're talking about the syntax, you talk about trees and things referencing other things, that a lot of it is just walking trees effectively. It reminds me a lot of the Git thing I mentioned actually, where everything's referencing another thing and then you're just literally walking a tree of stuff.
Yeah, there's lots of crazy algorithms in there too because we want to do this quickly. And so there's lots of algorithms about quickly traversing trees and finding changes, and all of the code files have, this is from this algorithm with a link to a PDF somewhere, and all the variable names in the code are all single letters because that's the math representation that was in the paper, and they wanted it to match so it's easy to work out if you did it right.
I hate that.
But yeah, it means you can't understand the code at all. I have no idea what it does. Whenever there's a bug and I'm like, oh no, hang on, is this a bug in the lowest common subsequence? Oh, I hope not, because I don't want to look at it. I
just remember back a developer I used to work with years ago, all his code was just literally all of it was just for loops with N and I and J and that kind of thing. And it's like, why not use proper variable names?
I've been broken by this. I used to be really annoyed at seeing Roslyn tests code because every class is called C and every method is called M, and they're so short. And in every language proposal, every spec, they're all just these tiny little letters, and it always annoyed me because I could never reason about it. They were too short for me. But I've been completely broken, and now every time I do anything, it's class C, method M. It's just it's been beaten. I've been beaten into submission.
Oh dear, I've lost what to say to that now.
I don't know.
So with we can't talk about Hot Reload without bringing up the whole .NET drama thing that happened.
I mean, we could.
Are we allowed to talk about that?
Well, I guess. Well, maybe I should have started with a disclaimer, but I guess I'll just quickly disclaim that I'm not an official Microsoft spokesman. I mean, it happened. We can talk about it. I'm not going to pretend it didn't. To be 100% genuinely honest, I have no idea about any of it more than anyone else. Working on Roslyn inside the engine of Hot Reload, I didn't know this was going to happen. I didn't know that it had happened until I saw it on Twitter, probably. And I didn't know that it was going to be reversed in a blog post written until I saw the blog post. So I'm not going to get in trouble for revealing any secrets because I honestly don't know any. I think I have a pretty low opinion of a lot of the conversation around a lot of the drama that goes on around .NET. And I mean, it's not even .NET. Like, there was drama recently about Go putting telemetry in, for example. I don't know if you saw that, but there's always lots of hot takes and, people getting angry. And I can understand that. I mean, it's fun to, write a quick hot take on Twitter. But I think maybe some people, I always like to then, once it's cooled down, maybe take a step back and maybe just consider the slightly bigger picture of what actually makes sense. So the blog post said that it was removed because the quality wasn't there. And I don't know. Again, I have no idea. I have to take that as face value because I don't know anything. But what I can say for sure is until I joined Microsoft, I had no idea that it could be so involved to actually ship software. Like, until you're in an enormous machine that is responsible for all sorts of things and has all sorts of, it was visible, very visible for lots of reasons. So my mind was blown. And so, there's lots of Visual Studio extensions written by Microsoft employees, and some of them are super popular to the point where there's lots of comments like, why isn't this just in Visual Studio? And the simple answer for that one, I can start a Visual Studio extension, file a new project, I can write some code, and I can publish it on the marketplace, an hour later, I don't know. If I want to put a feature in Visual Studio, it has to be translated into 14 languages. It has to go through an accessibility review, a UI review, a privacy review. We have 14 compliance tenants, and I don't remember them all. 6 of them are compliance, and the rest are quality tenants. Anyway, so it can be hard to ship software, and once we ship it, we own it. We have to maintain it, and it has to be backwards compatible, and we have to not break people. And so I could totally see that is a possible, plausible reality. I have no idea. But the other thing that I think is interesting is the people who are angry saying, it doesn't matter if it's not perfect, you shouldn't take it away. Fine. I suspect there's a large overlap between those people and the people who are angry saying, Hot Reload doesn't work, Microsoft can't do anything right. And, it's like, well, we can't have it both ways. The telemetry thing that came up with Go reminded me of this as well, because the .NET CLI has telemetry warning when you first run it, and it tells you how to disable it. And I know lots of developers who see that and they think, oh, telemetry, that's terrible, I'll turn it off. Fine, that's your right. Totally don't mind if you do that. But make sure you're not also the person saying, how come .NET still has array list? It's confusing for new developers. They should get rid of it. It's like, well, maybe if we had telemetry from every developer, we'd know we could. I don't know. Maybe we couldn't. I have no idea, Maybe there's some huge bank somewhere with 1 million developers that aren't on Twitter that use it every day. I don't know. But so I tend to try to avoid the drama just because, you need to take a step back and let cool heads prevail. But I am glad that the community spoke up and, they got their way, the change was made and Microsoft listened. So I'm all's well that ends well about this. I know there's also a lot of people that think anything like this happens at Microsoft, it's a sign of Microsoft being evil, and they start spelling Microsoft with the dollar signs, and they say embrace, extinguish, extend. I forgot. Anyway, I work for Microsoft, so obviously I'm going to say that's not what the reality is. They're not going to believe me because they'll think I'm a shill. I can only tell you in good faith that if Microsoft was evil, I wouldn't work here. I've turned down jobs at sports betting places that I didn't want to ethically support, so I didn't. But obviously I'm biased, so of course I'd say that. It's never attribute to malice that which is explained by incompetence. I don't know. I probably shouldn't say incompetence when talking about people above me, but Microsoft's a giant place with lots of people and things happen. I don't know. Sorry, that's a poor explanation.
I think the thing is, it's kind of, there hasn't been that many, air quotes, .NET dramas, and the fact that when it does happen, it becomes such a big thing, just to me tells me that if these issues were happening all the time, they wouldn't be big things because people would expect it. So that's a good thing, in my opinion.
Well, and people would abandon the platform. I mean, and I'm sure some people have. I certainly see my fair share of that type of feedback, but I'm on the Razor tooling team, as you mentioned, and mainly what I do these days is working on the Razor editor in Visual Studio. And I get no end of GitHub issues created that say, I can't believe this hasn't been fixed. How can you ship software like this? I'm going to go use Rider. Or I can't believe we pay money for Visual Studio. And people are very passionate about their tools, and I get it. But at the same time, there's 3 people on the Razor team who are full-time developers for all of the millions of customers of Visual Studio. Microsoft is this big amorphous blob with 200,000 employees sometimes, but it's not. It is, but it does so many different things. So yeah, I think a lot of the drama is definitely storm in a teacup. But if it was more real, I just think the platform wouldn't survive. And for the most part, I think most people sort of come back. And there has been times in the past as well where I think people have artificially tried to create drama for their own benefit. And, that's obviously not good. There's bad actors in every community, but hopefully there aren't many.
Well, for what it's worth, I think .NET is awesome and it's getting better and better all the time. So no complaints from me.
Me too. That's the main reason I'm biased is because I basically only know C# at this point, and I don't want to stop doing it. So I hope it stays around just because otherwise I'm out of a job. Which is also funny to think about when, as I mentioned, my dad being a lifelong COBOL programmer. The thought has occurred to me as I get older. He ended his career because a company wanted to rewrite their COBOL application in .NET. And so he took I think a 1-year contract to maintain the COBOL stuff while they rewrote, and then retired, 6 or 7 years later because they still hadn't quite shipped it because rewriting is hard. And it has occurred to me that there's a chance that I could be in that same boat if .NET does not remain relevant. But as long as it lasts another few years until I retire, it's fine.
I have a feeling it'll be around for quite some time. So you mentioned actually then that you only know C#. So how does Hot Reload work for things like F# or VB.NET?
I guess you reminded me, I do know VB.NET as well. And it's funny because I forget about VB a lot.
Me too.
To the extent that when I write most of the tests for Hot Reload, most of the code for Hot Reload, Edit and Continue is all in C#. Most of Roslyn is C#. And so I write C# and I write my code and I write my tests and everything's green and I open a PR and I push. But of course, on my local machine, I don't run all of the Roslyn tests because there's 100,000 plus of them. And so I completely forget that there's this other project here which has a bunch of VB tests and they all fail because I didn't write any code in them. And so I'm like, oh yeah, VB, and I have to go and write it. And of course, I have to write most of that in VB. So there's semicolons everywhere and I'm put brackets around my if statements. I completely forget. But the sort of the line in terms of Edit and Continue with VB is, unless there's some reason we can't support it, we do. And so far, there hasn't been a reason we can't support anything. And that's because, again, we're mainly dealing with how do we update a .NET DLL? And .NET is language agnostic. So it works. Some things don't. Like, I didn't have to do any work for records in VB, obviously, because there aren't any records. But for the most part, we just make it work. F# is not involved because edit and continue ultimately is a Roslyn feature, and F# does not use Roslyn. Roslyn compiler is C# and VB only, and so therefore edit and continue is a C# and VB feature. There are, there's nothing stopping F# from creating their own or implementing. I mean, maybe they do support edit and continue. I don't know. There's certainly nothing stopping them. In some respects, I wonder if it might even be easier in F# because the main thing with hot reload and edit and continue that makes it difficult is its job is to maintain your state. And in F#, yes, your application has state, but your functions, generally speaking, don't. That's the whole point. So potentially, it's actually easier to do it in F#, but maybe with a completely different approach. It sort of doesn't matter how you do this sort of thing as long as the runtime works, right? Like hot reload doesn't have to produce an efficient small DLL because it never exists on disk. So if the act of adding one method happens to update metadata for 10 methods, it doesn't really matter. So potentially, in F#, any change to a function could be, well, let's just create a new one because there was no state in it anyway. And if we update all the call sites to be the new one under the hood, no one will notice. I don't know. That's speculation. But yeah, it's generally a C# VB feature. And then obviously, XAML have their tooling and they do their things. Things like Razor work because Razor generates C#. So now we're back into Roslyn land. So
I guess with F#, I could be wrong because I'm not an F# developer, but I know that in F#, I think they use like REPL style programming much more, where you might just select a block on F5 and run that very succinct block. So maybe that might mean that it's needed less. I don't know.
Potentially it's needed less, but I think it's the same. That's sort of the same thing where the reason they can do that easily is because a function is a first-class citizen. So presumably if you can just run one function, you can probably also just update one function. But I don't know. Yeah, you might be right. Maybe it's not needed.
So is there anything else that we've missed before we move on to dev picks?
Anything and everything. I've no idea. I mean, I could talk about a lot more, but again, it's like, I don't know whether we need to. I guess the one thing I'll add before dev picks, but it's kind of cheating because it's kind of a dev tip maybe. There's an attribute that you can apply to your code to help hot reload. So in my spare time, many years ago, I used to stream on Twitch and I wrote a game, and hot reload worked because it was C# code and it was .NET DLLs and it all worked. And I didn't have to do anything. But my game, for speed, cached a lot of bitmaps and a lot of drawing paths and things like that. And so if I changed how a track, because my game's about train tracks, if I changed how a track was drawn, I could apply hot reload. And the thing, and I think I mentioned this at the very start, hot reload will update the code, but it's up to something else. It's up to a UI level framework almost to ensure that code runs. And so in my train game, I wrote the cache myself, and so no one was going to invalidate that cache or make sure that drawing algorithm reran. So there is an attribute that you can put into your code, so you will get called by the runtime after it applies a hot reload update. And it tells you what types it updated, so you can get some kind of scoping. And so you can invalidate a cache, or you can go and download a different file, or you can do whatever you need to do. But so that's like the one thing that I think we don't really talk about it much in Microsoft. And it's kind of niche because it really depends on your type of application. But there's, I think, a lot of applications where if hot reload doesn't work for you, in a way that like you press hot reload and it seems like nothing happens, but there's no errors, it could be that you need to use this to just help the runtime work out, okay, you've updated the code, but you've got to run it again, right? That's the reason hot reload doesn't work at the moment with, for example, minimal APIs, because that program class runs once and that's it. If you change it and you press hot reload, Roslyn will update the code. I promise you we're updating the code. but nothing's running it. And that's, that's the end of my job. So it's up to someone else. So they're trying to work that out. So, and they'll use this attribute, but you can use that attribute too. So if you've got, for the right type of application, for a big enough application where you do your own caching, you do your own anything really, code generation, if you've got scripts, you've got plugins, that might be something to look into to sort of bridge that gap between everything I've talked about for the hour and actually being relevant to your job.
That's quite fascinating, actually. I feel like I just need to throw that attribute in anyway and just see it being called and log something out, and just it sounds quite interesting knowing that you can hook into that.
I just realized I haven't mentioned the name of the attribute, and I've possibly just forgotten it. It's metadata. Oh no, metadata update apply, I think.
We can put it in the show notes as well.
Yeah, I'll try and find a link to the documentation page. I mean, it is documented, like it's a public thing, but it's not something we sort of talk about too much that I've seen, as far as, here's something you could add to your code to make it more hot reload compatible.
That's very cool. So moving on to dev tips then, you've kind of already done one already. My tip I've kind of already done already, because mine was the Git thing I mentioned earlier. I was just going to say that I recommend, if you use Git and what developer doesn't, that you actually just spend a little bit of time just learning how commits, trees and blobs, those object type work. And I actually did the 15-minute intro into that in YouTube, which I can include in the show notes, explaining how that works. But it's one of these things that's actually very surprisingly super simple once you actually start learning and thinking, is that it? And then it kind of like changes. You don't need to know it to use Git, but when you're using Git, having that knowledge just changes your perspective on how it all fits together. So it's quite nice.
I'm a huge fan of understanding, one abstraction layer below where you need to. I'm a huge fan of that in general. I love it specifically with C#. Every time there's a new C# language feature, I open up SharpLab and I use it, and I just look at what the decompiled code looks like, because I'm interested, because I couldn't come up with how to implement it, but I can kind of look at what people have done and go, oh, that's interesting. So yeah, I love that sort of thing. I think it informs how you do everything, and just helps you in all sorts of situations. I do have a dev tip though. I did prepare, and as a unhandled exception listener since episode 1, I am going to say it's a dev tip because I'm old school. But so the other, I mentioned that we allowed deleting methods in hot reload by just lying to the runtime. And I love it because you can commit all sorts of crimes. But my tip for hot reload, if you hit a root edit that is insurmountable. So for example, you can't capture a new variable in a Lambda expression. There's nothing you can do about that, right? Hot reload doesn't support it. There's not enough information in the DLL for us to do anything with it, so we can't. Maybe one day we'll be able to fix it, but at the moment we can't. If you hit that limitation though, that's kind of the end of your hot reload session. So that doesn't help you with the inner loop stuff. So the dev tip is, if you get into a situation where you can't change the inside of a method for some reason, delete the method, apply hot reload. It will happily do that. Press Control-Z to undo, or Control-Z if you're in America, and change your code to capture this new thing in the Lambda, or make your method async is another great example. You're not allowed to make a method async. But if you delete the method, hot reload, then put back a method with the exact same name that happens to be async, Roslyn will go, oh, you've added a method. Yeah, you're totally allowed to add an async method, that's fine. And it will happily do the update. It's a little bit dodge because you end up with two methods. One of them's not async, one is. They're both called the same thing, which is invalid in C#. But again, we only have to produce .NET DLLs, and .NET happily have multiple methods with the same name and different return types. So that's my dev tip. Delete the method and then try again.
That's quite cool. Yeah, I tend to just get because I run it on the command line. Do you know how it says if it's got to restart it, it says, would you like to do this automatically from now onwards within this execution? Yes. So I tend to always do that and then kind of assume it's going to do that. But yeah, that's a cool tip.
I see lots of people saying hot reload only works for me in .NET Watch. And most of the time it says it doesn't work, but then it works anyway or something. And what's happening there is hot reload didn't work, but .NET Watch just recompiled your entire project. But their project is small enough or their machine is fast enough that they don't actually realize that's not Hot Reload. So I see that and I'm like, no, Hot Reload didn't work. But it is, I think we are lucky with modern machines that we get to just write some terrible code and it just keeps on trucking along because they're so fast. I remember doing load testing on like hosting a website in the Azure portal, and we were getting fantastic throughput. It was great. We thought everything was going well. And then we looked at the logs afterwards, and the website was crashing constantly, but the portal just spun up a new copy and we kept going. We didn't even notice. We just had such terrible code, but it's like, meh, we got CPU cycles. Let's spend them. It's funny.
I think now just disk space and memory and everything is just so much better. I remember, because I used to work in the games industry, and we had to do it like with C and C++, and I were constantly having to pay attention to like cache hits and misses and all that kind of thing, and like quite low level stuff. And yeah, I've not thought about that in such a long time.
Yeah,
but I'm doing a different kind of development now, so I'm not doing games anymore. So that is probably the type of apps I'm now working on. It's less of an issue.
There's types of apps where that still matters, and actual Visual Studio is a great one for that, because Visual Studio has millions of users, and there's essentially no such thing as an edge case in Visual Studio. If you write some code and you think, well, this will work for the 99% of people, that's great. But there's hundreds of thousands of people who are in that 1%. And so there is, so many performance optimizations that we have to do that would be, if you wrote a blog post suggesting that everyone does this, you would be laughed off the internet, because it is premature optimization and blah, blah, blah. But, on the right type of program, yeah, and a game is a great example. All that caching I was talking about, that's because all of my code has to run in 16 milliseconds or my game feels terrible to use. And that's a hard limit. I can't beat that. So you just have to, sometimes you have to go into the weeds and actually fix this stuff.
Yeah, with the game thing, because it was generally in a loop. You'd have a loop of just going round, and each iteration of that loop has to be a 60th of a second, so you've got 60 frames a second. Then you've got to make sure that things are performed.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you do a timer that's 60 frames a second, and then depending on how you do the timer, you quickly notice you're either doubling up and trying to do two things at once, so everything goes wrong, or you're delaying, and so shows it up very quickly.
Cool. So looking at the time, we are probably out of time, but where's if anyone, well, obviously your video that you mentioned, your NDC, I will put in the show notes, and you've actually got diagrams and stuff, so that might make it a bit easier to understand, and it's
bit more visual. Yes,
very well explained from the bit I watched. I'm going to watch the second half later today, but I will include that in the show notes, and I would recommend everyone watch that because it's really interesting. But apart from that, where's the best place for listeners to get hold of you if they've got any questions?
Well, I'm on Mastodon. I'm at David Wengier at oz.social, but possibly the easiest way these days is just GitHub. With our fancy GitHub readmes we get to create now. So github.com/David Wengier, you'll find me. You can see what I'm working on. You can review all of the code I write for work, which is kind of horrific to think about sometimes, but it's a thing. So
have you given up on Twitter then now?
I haven't. Yes, I'm going to say yes. I have. I've given up. I think I still have the app on my phone, but I don't get notifications from it, and I haven't tweeted anything in long enough that I'm sure I've disappeared off the long tail. Yeah, I moved over. I think I was in the first wave, but I've been enjoying Mastodon because I'm on an Australian server, and on Twitter I was connected to lots and lots of .NET people, and they're mainly in a non-compatible time zone, which was kind of good because Twitter wasn't a huge distraction for me at work because everyone was asleep. But it was kind of also, there was something missing. On the Australian Mastodon server, I really enjoy the fact that when I wake up in the morning, I can click and look at a list of people who are all saying, "Oh, good morning, today looks like it's a great day." I actually kind of wish it was even more focused and it was just Melbourne, but anyway, so I've been enjoying that aspect of Mastodon, and I'm not trying to get it to replace Twitter. So I've deliberately sort of left in order to adjust my social media use, let's say.
Yeah, one thing I really like about Mastodon is the fact that you can follow hashtags as if it was a user.
Yes.
So I find that really nice. I'm using hashtags a lot more in my, I can't say tweets, what are they called? Hoots, are they?
They were called toots, and then I think they changed
Toots.
them to posts, but it may have come full circle. I don't know. Yeah, I love that. I follow the C# and .NET hashtag as well, and it's just, I see content from so many different people. Yeah, it's fantastic.
Yeah, definitely. I kind of use both, but it's kind of, I've still not settled on one, but I guess I don't need to. I can have 2 tabs open, it's all good.
Exactly.
Awesome stuff. So, and obviously all of those like social links that you mentioned will include in the show notes anyway. So with that, just a massive thank you for joining me on the show. It's been like really fascinating.
Thank you. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and quite an honour for the 50th.
Yeah, 50. That's quite exciting. It's been a few years coming, but we've got to the 50th.
Happy to come back and talk about anything at any time. This is great fun.
Oh, definitely. Absolutely. Cool. And thank you everyone else for listening. And a quick reminder that this podcast is sponsored by Everstack, which is my own company providing software development and consultation services. For more information, visit everstack.com. And if you enjoy the podcast, please do help me spread the word on social media. I normally use the hashtag unhandledexception, and I can be found on Twitter at Drakan, or Mastodon, which I can't remember the full name because it's much longer. So I'm going to put that. Well, it's on the podcast website anyway. And my DMs to both are quite open as well. And my blog, danclock.com, has links to all of those stuff too. And as I mentioned, we'll include links to all the different things we've mentioned in the show notes, which can be found on unhandledexceptionpodcast.com. So you've heard this bit live now. So
I think I assumed it was done live, but also it's you're very consistent. So well done. You do it well.
Well, that bit's reading off. I read it.
Yeah. I could tell.
Everything else I don't read, but that bit I do read.
Yeah.
Most of it's like, if I haven't with this one because it felt like this was more conversational, but sometimes if it's more obvious, I'll do a bullet pointed list of just cues for myself that I want to ask, just so I can remember. But most of it, like, it's only like the outro and there's a bit in the intro.
Yeah.
And then obviously the listener mention that gets scripted.
It's funny thinking about the outro, doing it live. I met Nick Chapsis for the first time in Sydney at this NDC, and there was part of my brain that was just constantly wanting to ask him to do the intro and the outro because he does it so quick. It's like, surely he doesn't do that every time. It's funny, but I've seen Richard Campbell do the the .NET Rocks one live every day, and it sounds 100% identical every single time. It's just you just do it.
It's just so drilled, isn't it?
Yeah.
With the YouTube thing I've started, I don't know, with the podcast editing, it's like really, if you may have heard me a few times, just go back a few words and start again because I know I'm going to edit. And you can chop out bits very, very easily. It's like, this is going to be quite an easy edit because you don't seem to and ah a lot, but some guests like and ah a lot. But actually, it's surprising by how much you can, like pretty much every like some of those episodes, every single sentence has chops in it. Wow. And you just can't, it's hard to tell. Yeah. But with YouTube, you get the video jumping, so you can't really do that as much. So it's, I mean, that's why the big reason I started streaming on Twitch was because I knew I never wanted to edit a video. I was like, I'm going to do it live, and on Twitch, there's no expectation that it's not live, so the pressure was off. Because, no. I mean, it's I assume that the YouTube video is like, I mean, the main job is editing, really, isn't it? Like, it's not even content creation being the main job. It's just editing. It's video editing, I assume. I love the idea of a short, there's so many things that come across your plate and you think, I could just do a 10-minute explainer on this and it'd be really good, right? Because here's a question that I've seen on Twitter or Slack or Discord or whatever. Do a video. But I just know that 10-minute video would take 4 hours to record. And I'm just, no, sorry, not today. I must admit, I'm quite enjoying, because I'm just starting learning DaVinci Resolve, and I'm quite enjoying learning the editing and learning how to do different effects and tricks and stuff.
That's good.
To be honest, it's like in the same way as like when I use my ID, I kind of like learn all the different keyboard shortcuts. Yeah. With the podcast editing with Adobe Audition, I made sure I learned what's the fastest way I can do each of these small things, so I can be quite quick with it. And I'm doing the same with DaVinci Resolve. And I think once you've done it a few times, it becomes faster and faster. And I'm new to YouTube editing, but I'm finding that I'm speeding up dramatically each time. And I quite enjoy it. It's just a different thing to learn, a different thing to play with.
No, it's good. And I mean, YouTube is forgiving to that choppy video. Like, people know that's what you have to do. As long as, like, there's a threshold where it's a bit silly. But I think for a short video, I think it's totally reasonable. When you sit down to watch if someone's got a 1 hour video and it's constantly chopping, I just tend to be like, well, no, this is not, like, I don't know. But I personally, I don't actually watch many conference talks on YouTube or anything that long, because I have YouTube going in the background while I'm working, like in the corner of my screen, pretty much all day until I run out of things to watch. So I really don't notice the chopping and changing. I'm actually mostly just listening. And then sometimes I'll hear something that I want to, oh, hang on, and I'll go back. But so I've been enjoying the videos.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it's it'd be, well, with the podcast where it's kind of like an hour long things, this is just like 10-minute things, but I couldn't do that. I know Nick Chapsas has started a podcast, but he's doing that on YouTube, so it's live. So I don't know what form of editing he does, but he must have to like try and do it where it doesn't require much editing, because
I don't think he does it much. I mean, I listen to it, so I don't notice it, but it's harder to tell on audio. I get the impression just from listening to it that I don't think he does much, just because there's a few things where it's like, well, you could have cut that bit out. Didn't matter that you didn't. I think that's also like a thing of, do you go for the hour podcast, or he's at like 2.5 hours, which again, it's like, I don't think anyone expects a 2.5 hour podcast to be edited, because that's a different mindset kind of thing. So
I think he also has very, very high profile people on there, so that are used to public speaking. So when he has someone that's like quite less experienced, that is umming and ahhing all the time, which some of my guests have, then it's going to be a much harder experience for the listeners if that's not edited.
I am curious where Nick's going to go, because he's starting with the big names, which is great. You should, if you can. It's the only reason I got any followers on Twitch was because I know Imo Landworth, and he tweeted about it, and he's got lots of followers. Like, I don't fault him. Well, I mean, Nick probably has more followers than the people he's interviewing in this case. But I am curious to see where it goes, and I hope it continues once, he runs out of famous people to interview. I take it as a lifetime achievement that at NDC Sydney, I was on a boat, because it was a boat cruise, and I was talking to a couple of friends, and Nick Chapsas came up the stairs and saw me and said, "Oh my God, David!" I was like, "Wait, what? Like, you're the most famous person here. How the hell do you know who I am?" But he watches a lot of YouTube, so he'd seen my NDC talks or something. So I thought that was very funny, though.
It was quite funny. The user group I run, .NET Oxford. Well, you've spoken at that.
Yes, I have.
Which was quite a few years ago now. Before all
2020. Yep.
Was it 2020?
Yeah,
I thought it was earlier.
I think so. Or was it? Well, it was either 2020 or 2019. They're the only two times I did NDC. Well, and this year I did London as well. But anyway, sorry, what were you saying?
So a few months ago, we had an in-person Lightning Talk event.
Yep.
And so I was doing the intro talk, stood up at the front, and did the intro talk, looked around, and suddenly it wasn't like a huge audience or anything. It was quite a small group. And Nick Chapsas was in the back row. I was like, double take. So that was awesome to meet him in person as well. And before that, he'd been on the podcast, so I've spoken to him like we are now. But that was the first time I met him in person. Yeah.
Well, it was interesting when you were reading the Twitter comment about putting the face to the voice with the YouTube videos. I think for me, this was super easy because, we've met before. Like, it was years ago, but I know it happened, So it was funny. Yeah, no, I enjoyed. I finally did that talk. The talk that I did at Oxford, I finally did again at another conference last year. But I think I decided after NDC London this year that I'm not going to travel internationally anymore for conferences. I think I'm getting a bit old, and I'm not. It's a lot of work because I live. Australia is just a long way away, right? And my overarching thought when I was walking around London, just walking, trying to not fall asleep and be jet lagged. And, I wasn't really even doing much sightseeing because I've been plenty of times to London. But my overarching thought this time walking around was like, oh, I wish the kids were here because I could show them this. And I think as they get older, it's like, well, I'm happy to go, but only if I can bring everyone with me. So, yeah. Anyway.
And that gets really expensive because we've got my wife's sister and her husband live in Australia.
Oh, okay.
And so we were actually going to be going this year, but I've had quite a few back issues, which is actually, I've had a steroid injection, which seemed, touch wood, a few weeks ago, which seems to have made it much better. So fingers crossed.
That's a long flight with a bad back.
Yeah, exactly. So that's kind of what we decided. So we've kind of postponed it a bit. But yeah, it's a long, long way.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. It's, and I mean, so my kids, like my eldest next year is in high school. And so taking him out of school is probably not great. You know, as they get older, it's like that gets harder as well. But maybe once they then get older again, that we can leave them behind. Maybe then we'll come. Just me and my wife. Anyway, but it is. I mean, I love the fact that I got to speak at .NET Oxford. It's like who gets to say that? Well, obviously, presumably, lots of people in England get to say that, but no one in Australia. And I didn't. I hate online talks. I ended up doing a few in 2020 because obviously a couple of in-person things transferred to online, and I submitted to a couple of conferences. And, oh yeah, this will be fine. I stream on Twitch, watch the difference. And it turns out I hate them. I need that audience reaction. I need that, I need to be talking to someone, not an empty screen. And so if I don't do online, I'm not traveling. Oh well. But I'm also off Twitter, so, I'll just kind of disappear into the background.
Well, you've got to have a life as well, and you said you've got like family and things. So
well, that's it, and I think that's as you get older and the kids get older, and I'm starting to appreciate more. Like when I used to travel every year just for work when my kids were babies and things, and it was very much I don't know that they noticed I was gone because they're too young, kind of thing. And then now, obviously, they're 8 and 11. It's completely a different ballgame for them, but also we have a different relationship where, we play Xbox together and things. It's like we actually, yeah. So, yeah. Yeah,
with kids, you only get so many holidays with them as well. And if you actually work that out before they get to an age where they don't want to come anymore, there's actually not that many.
No.
If you think about how many summers there are.
No, I suspect my eldest is only a couple of years away from not wanting to come, but being too young to not come. And so we just have an argument for a whole week. But we'll see.
Yeah, mine are 6 and 9.
Oh yeah, so a couple of years behind.
Nice age.
Same gap as ours, but yeah, a couple of. Yeah, I mean it's good. For us, during the pandemic, obviously Melbourne was in lockdowns for a long time. It made us closer, which is nice because some families struggled. But I think it also made us a little bit more insular and a bit, we're homebodies. And so we just, my sister went away last weekend to a little country town that we've been to plenty of times. And she's asked me, what do you do when you're there? What do you stop off on the way? What's there to do? What's there to see? And I'm like, we just go and exist in another house for a bit and it's a break. Like we don't go for fanfare. Like we're just happy being around each other, which is good. It's lucky that I get to say that, but at the same time, it does make me feel differently about the work travel and things. So I don't know.
Yeah. I'm aware. What time is it over there? It must be getting quite late now. I guess.
It's just gone 10:30, so it's not too bad.
So it's not too bad. Yeah, I normally go to bed about like 9:30, so that's super late to me.
We have a couple of smart light switches. And I have the one over the stairs programmed to turn off at 10 o'clock, which is the signal that if I'm still on the couch and the light on the stairs goes off, it's like, okay, you should finish the episode or whatever of the game and go to bed. Like it's getting there. It's quite a nice signal. But yeah, I'm usually in bed by now, but I'll be on my phone for whatever. So it's all good.
Fair enough. Well, I will let you get to bed then. I'm just going to take one more screenshot in case the other one came. Are you okay if I tweet out a screenshot that we've done this?
Of course.
Cool. Oh, sorry, not tweet, post, whatever it's called.
Do all of the above. Well, you have to tweet because I'm not going to. So.
Fair enough. I'll do both. And everyone gets to see all the Lego.
Cool.
And, it's not actually showing my messy cupboard, so that's quite good.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much for the invite.
That's okay, and I'll take you up on that doing it again as well.
I can give you a list of topics I know about, or you can ask me. Do you know about this?